Hey, folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to be bringing on an author whose book I was very much looking forward to. So, we have on Mike Billett. He is a peatland specialist, peatland researcher. He's just written this new book, Peat and Whiskey, The Unbreakable Bond. Came out in the UK in 2023, came out in the US, North America, 2024. And just from the cover alone, I can tell you some of the luminaries that have said nice things about this book, such as an introduction by Dave Broom. We've got Charles McLean on here, Brian Townsend. I mean, these are big names in the whiskey industry, particularly in the UK. If you're familiar with the UK, so clearly this is an important book. And with that, I am thrilled to bring on Mike to talk about not only the book itself, but his work, how he got into this, and anything else that comes up. So with that, Mike, welcome on.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, and good evening. Well, good evening from Edinburgh. I'm not sure
Yeah,
what it's midday in your part of the world, but yeah, it's a typical Scottish early evening winter day. So it's good. Probably a dram later on as well, just to keep things warm.
for sure, for sure. I myself am drinking tea, so my voice keeps going, but afterwards I will be drinking something peated in honor of the conversation for sure.
Yeah, well,
So let's jump into it. Number one, let's introduce yourself. How do you get into even before the whiskey side? How do you get into peatland science?
yeah, I'm a scientist. I worked in science. I've had I think, an interesting career in many ways. Of Yeah, an unscripted career. So I started off life as a geologist. I did a doctorate in geology. I spent my summers working in Arctic Norway, and practiced as a geologist for a while, but became more and more interested in the environment. And I went to do some research and retrained a bit in soil science. And my project was in the acid rain days, and people were worried about acidification. I worked on projects with water, and that kind of took me from rocks to soils to water. So we're going further up, nearer the surface of the earth. And we got quite a big contract to work on peat, particularly the colour, the peaty essence of water in Scotland. Obviously, we have a lot of peatlands. About 20% of Scotland are peatlands, and they have a big influence on water colour. As if anybody's visited Scotland during a wet time, um, uh, will testify. So, for the last 25 years of my career, I worked on peatlands in increasingly large groups because peatland, or the global peatland science community, is big, and we worked on multidisciplinary projects. Um, and latterly, I worked quite a lot in the Canadian Arctic with groups of scientists who were working on climate change, or looking at the stability of peatlands um, in these northern places. So, I've stepped away, if you like, from the cold face of university academic research. Obviously, you never leave science, and I wanted to combine. I've always wanted to write a popular science book about peat because I think it's an oft misunderstood soil. Um, and I thought, well, how can I give it a twist for something different? So I decided to write a book about two things that I love. Actually, three things I love: peat, whiskey, and peatlands, the landscapes from which peat occurs. So my kind of interest in whiskey, I mean, um, really in single malt whiskies really started, I would say, about 25 years ago. Blends is where many of us started as a student. Single malts weren't really available; a couple were, but it was, I think it's the thing that interests me most is this connection between whiskey, the history of whiskey, and landscape as well, the whole sort of cultural aspect as well. So actually, the first, whiskey that really kind of opened my eyes was a Kalila 18-year-old, given to me by a Frenchman actually as a present, and I just tasted this whiskey, a smoky whiskey, and it just took my breath away. I thought, wow, this is special, and as I say, the rest is history. But I do drink other whiskies besides smoky whiskey, by the way. A lot of people apologize sometimes when they say, "Sorry, Mike, I don't have anything smoky." But yeah, I just enjoy the whole whiskey landscape. And not just in Scotland, I write in the book about Ireland as well. And
Mhm.
also, one of the really interesting areas I think is global peat and the way distilleries around the world are starting to use their own peat. But maybe we'll come on to that later. So really my kind of backstory is from rocks, soils, water, and then to peat. And, as a scientist, I obviously wrote a lot of scientific papers. We write in a particular way. And I think I realized when I wanted to write a book like this, I wanted to write a popular science book in a more creative way. So I actually went back to evening class at Edinburgh University here and did a creative writing course just to open my eyes to just different ways of using words. And it was a wonderful experience, meeting other people and doing homework again and really kind of testing yourself. And, it's it's been a really enjoyable thing. And, writing Peat and Whiskey.
I mean, you already answered a couple of questions I had. One of which was, how do you get in the mindset of writing this type of work? Because in doing the research for this episode, I did read a couple of your scientific papers, particularly around a particular project you were doing in the late '90s, which papers came out in the early 2000s for, and that was more about the carbon capturing properties of peat and how it carried in water, was aerosolized into the,
Yeah,
or not aerosolized, downstream and such. So this is obviously, as you said, a popular science book. This is very different, uh, both thematically and stylistically. And it's a book that arguably, if you were just interested in peat and peatlands and were not interested in whiskey, perhaps, I think you could still really enjoy this book and get a lot
yeah,
out of it.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's interesting. That's really interesting thing you say because I've done quite a lot of events with the book, not just with whiskey people, but at book festivals. I did an event on Friday in England, and a lot of people came to the event who were not whiskey people, and they bought the book, and they said, "This is the first whiskey book that I've bought," and it's this connection to landscape, history, place. I love travel writing, so I kind of try and talk about the journey and the people I met and my sort of the feelings of the place. As a reader, I like to be taken to places that I wouldn't necessarily go.
mhm,
And I've been to, the middle of a peat bog is not everybody's cup of tea, as we say. So these
right, for
cold,
sure.
wet places. So yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of writers I've met say, you know, one of the key things about being a good writer is to read a lot. And my reading now is just so expansive. I've got all sorts of weird and wonderful, but I think as a writer, you become interested in the structure of books, what works, doesn't work. And, writing this book for me was a sort of a journey of exploration, you know. And I had some very good people who were also giving me some advice as well.
Of course, and I think you build on a very strong literary tradition that is specific to Scotland and Ireland and the UK of travel writing as it relates to whiskey. We're just a couple of the names that are mentioned in the book, but also came to mind: Alfred Barnard, of course, Martin Martin, Boswell and Johnson, Geikie. These are,
Yeah,
but maybe not Boswell and Johnson and Geikie. They may not be as well known as the others two, but these are people whose writing, even a century and a half ago, are still very popular today. They're drawn on for a lot of research, and they had a particular narrative style that tried to bring the reader along with them for the journey.
yeah,
And
yeah,
in the, I would say in the entire book, I felt that, but there's one particular chapter towards the end, walking on 90% water, that I think is taken by itself as a chapter is probably did this. I don't want to say the best. That's not the right way to say it, but did this
yeah,
in the most direct way of bringing the reader along as you went through the peat bogs and
yeah,
walking through and walking up the mountainsides, etc.
yeah,
So for me, I definitely appreciate that. It brings the reader in. It makes you feel like you're reading an exploration, an experience.
yeah, yeah. And I think the other thing that was it comes to the book. I mean, I often, you read a book, maybe on whiskey, and it's difficult to source material. So I was really keen that when I wrote this book, that I'd have a good, table of notes and references, because to allow people then to look at what I've looked and maybe make a different judgment. But research. I mean, I obviously come from a research background, and it was an absolute joy to explore archives, talk to people, try to chase stories and try and discover, for example, where the Prohibition, the Freud stories was real or not, and all these things.
Mm.
So, it was a natural thing for me to sort of um, do the research. And, I think writers talk about disappearing down the rabbit hole of research. And the difficult bit is coming up to the surface again,
Mm.
and getting words on paper. So yeah, I think the research side came quite naturally to me, and I really enjoyed it. Um,
Yeah, I mean, my original background, many, many years ago now, was biochemical sciences, and
okay,
I eventually went down a different path, went down medieval history and the whole thing. Oddly enough, studying oak in East Anglia, so that came back around to whiskey eventually with woodlands and forests, completely unintentionally. But again, reading these scientific papers brought me back to that era a little bit.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
certainly will not claim to be understanding everything I was reading, but I got enough of it that I could kind of parse out the parts that were going to be relevant and most important. But to the point of the research, it brought up several names and papers and books that I want to look into. For example, Dr. Barry Harrison's thesis. I want to read his original PhD thesis.
yeah,
Nick
yeah,
Morgan, because there are just these. It seems like you look at a title, and titles are everything in many ways. It's the first thing someone's going to see, and you look at the title, and you're like, oh, that looks like something that is going to increase my knowledge on this subject, and it's going to be worth the time of 100, 200 pages of scientific writing. So no, I appreciate the expansive notes as well, and I will be diving more into those after this interview to see just what I can find, what I can get access to. I'm no longer affiliated with the university, so I'm a little more limited than I used to be. But uh, no,
but
I appreciate that.
yeah, I mean, so much more academic material is now available. I mean, for example, Dr. Barry Harrison's thesis now is downloadable, um,
Mhm.
from Harriet Watt University. So and obviously that's one of the if you like seminal pieces of work that's been done in this subject area.
For sure. So let's dive into the book. There are a couple of topics. We're not going to cover everything, of course, that is in here, but there are a couple of topics that I definitely want to cover, starting with things like we're going to talk about regionality in peat, the evolution of the use of peat in whiskey and how that impacted both flavor, production, and many other things besides. Things, just the process itself. What is peat? We're going to go back to the
Yeah,
beginning on this, and the many uses besides. As I said, you can read this book and get quite a bit out of it, even if you have no interest in whiskey. It's because peat has many other properties and qualities that you can use. So I think with that, and then I have one final question at the end that I'm hoping you're not going to see coming. It's a fun question, but I'm hoping you're not going to see coming. So let's just start at the very beginning here. It's a very good place to start with what is peat?
yeah. Well, peat is a soil, a soil that covers about 3% of the Earth's land surface. And it's a soil that occurs in wet places, whether we can use different languages, lagoons, swamps, wetlands, bogs, mires. But many of these places need to be wet to slow down the decomposition of the vegetation. So peat consists of partially decomposed plant remains that are in various states of decomposition. Um, Peat will form about 1 millimeter a year on average. So we generally talk about peat growth. And of course, in places like Scotland and North America, peat started forming on after the end of our last ice age on bare surfaces, whether they be rock or soil, that were wet, and which plants became established. So year on year, peat would grow and become thicker and thicker. And I've worked in peatlands in Scotland with peats up to 7 or 8 meters thick, and that represents thousands upon thousands. I think some of our oldest peats are probably 9 or 10,000 years old in the UK. So you get this long history of peat growth. And within the peat, you can see the fluctuations in climate, you can see changes in vegetation. And peat at times would grow faster than others. And in Scotland and Ireland, this part of the world, we talk about having the perfect climate envelope for peat growth. So we have plant growth during the summer. We have cold winters when the plants break down, but they never break down completely, which means incrementally the peats will gradually grow year by year. So in parts of Britain, say on the west coast of Ireland, west coast of Scotland, the peats are probably growing. I've seen figures of 3 or 4 millimeters. And then in my part, I'm speaking to you from Edinburgh, on the east coast of Scotland, we talk about the cool, dry east rather than the warm, wet west. So peat is accumulating, but not at those rates. So peat forms in different places. We talk about blanket peats, which really blanket the whole landscape. You mentioned walking on 90% water, which is chapter 6 in the book. I mean, that's walking across largely blanket peats. And then we have what we call basin peats, um, which form in depressions. Many of them are old kind of lakes or lagoons at the end of the ice age, and they form these sort of dome elevations of peat. Sometimes they're called raised bogs. I mean, to be honest, we can talk about peat classification to the cows come home, as we say, but it's probably not that interesting a subject because countries have different words, different terms, but in terms of the peat. So what I mean, basically, in terms of their use in the whiskey industry, the ones that were most attractive were close to distilleries, and they would be cut seasonally. So, so peat, yeah, as a material, is a soil. It grows, and the plot at different rates in different parts of the world. But the key thing that affects flavor and the characteristics of the peat are the plants within the peat bog. And our key plant in our peats throughout the world is sphagnum moss, this sort of super moss, which creates this wet conditions. And on top of that, it will have different plants in different parts of the world, which gives sort of a nuance or a characteristic depending really on what we call the trophic status of the peat. And by that, I mean the number of nutrients or the amount of nutrients. So, for example, if the peat is receiving all its water from rain, it's relatively acidic. And we talk about acidic peats in Scotland. We have excellent acidic waters derived from those peats. And then we have the nutrient-rich peats, which would derive their water primarily from things like groundwater. So different types of plants are going to become established on those sorts of situations. So it's, you know, one of the things that kind of, I like people to talk about peat as soils, this sort of magical soil, not as mud or dirt or anything like that, because it's such a fascinating material. And I think that's um, one of the things I wanted to write about in the book was really trying to get people to understand more about what this somewhat mystical but wonderful material is.
Sure. And to go back to a phrase you used in the introduction, misconceptions about
Yeah,
peat. So, I come to peat knowledge straightly through whiskey. That, that's that's it. And I can imagine after reading the book that other people come at it from an agronomic standpoint. It's very useful as both fertilizer, as sometimes as feed, depending on, as you said, the trophic state of the peat. It's also used as fuel. So if you're coming at it from that aspect, perhaps more historically, but still in the more remote areas of
yeah,
the world, peat's going to be used as fuel. And so the one of the perhaps the biggest misconception that I was faced with in reading the book was this idea that, as you said, peat is it's 3% of the world's land surface, it's also on all seven continents. It's found in pretty much every climate zone. And to your point, I had always thought of it as needing this cold, if you will, Scottish environment to grow, cold, wet,
Yeah,
etc. But you mentioned there are some places in the tropics where there are where there is peat, maybe under a different name, but there's peat, and it's growing at a rate of, I think, one place at 20 millimeters per
yeah,
year,
yeah,
which
yeah.
is, I mean, for an
Much, much
American audience,
faster.
it's yeah, it's just shy of an inch per
Yeah,
year. That's significant. But the larger part being this is all over the world, and it's obviously going to have its own flavors and uses and functions and properties throughout the world. But it's not just from Scotland, not just from the West Coast or Islay
yeah,
or Donegal in Ireland.
yeah, yeah.
Although in Donegal it's 62% of the land, so that's um, quite a bit on there. So the if I read this correctly, the original connection that was made, the bond that was made. So early on, this is in the first chapter, first or second chapter, where we're talking about how did Peat and Whiskey become bonded, and obviously the subtitle of this book, "The Unbreakable Bond,"
Yeah,
puts them together. And you pinpointed, along with research from Dave Broom, the 17th century as this period where the bond was formed. It's when it became bonded in both thought and practice. You had peat being used as fuel. This is pre-coal. This is pre-oil. Pre, any of the
yeah,
modern fuel sources that we've got today,
yeah,
non-fossil fuel sources. Really, the only other major option was probably woodland, and that's only if woodland existed
yeah.
in the area, which in many areas of Scotland that used and Ireland that used peat, it did not. So it's to me, it seems like peat started more so from the fuel side as opposed to the flavoring side. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that's correct. And you know, yeah, you talk about 17th century. That's when I mean the relationship is 400 or 500 years old, and the Irish obviously used generated or produced peated whiskey, and the in terms of poitín and the
Mm-hmm.
way peat was used in the more remote rural parts of Ireland. So there's always I mean, it's one thing Dave Broom talks about as well, is about how did this bond become established? And there are people who think it's just serendipitous. So it actually, it was used as a fuel and it became embedded in the flavor profile. But if you read uh, a number of texts, included one by a guy called Murray who was writing, I think, in the 17th century. He talks about distillers making a deliberate choice to use peat as opposed to other materials and even coal because of its superior flavor it generated in terms of the malted barley. So, I mean, the whole journey, I mean, you mentioned wood. I mean, we know that wood was used in small stills in parts of Scotland where there was trees. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
basically, you would use the most available fuel source.
Sure.
Sometimes fuels were chosen that didn't generate smoke, so the excise men wouldn't come
Mm-hmm.
and find you. The um, so the relationship, obviously, one of the things that I really enjoyed writing about was this changing relationship, from a time when peat was used primarily as a fuel, and then now, of course, we just use a flavor component. But the one of the big drivers was when you wanted to distill at larger volumes, you needed a more energy-rich fuel source, and that's, of course, where coal wins over peat. It's got about 10 times the calorific value. Um, so when you had larger stills, you just couldn't really generate enough energy um, to heat stills. So that's when it became um, replaced. But it's interesting because I think it was peated whiskey, from the Highlands had a premium,
Mm-hmm.
premium value. It was sometimes mimicked as well, but certainly was regarded as a superior flavor. And then, we went through the period of blending when, big markets, particularly in North America, appeared to sort of lose taste for peat, if that's the right component. But a lot of blends, interestingly, did retain a smoky component, all in a rather withdrawn way. And I think many of us, including myself, feel that that provided the platform, which allowed when we got into the 1990s, which saw peated whiskey started to really become established. When I was a student, you just couldn't get peated malt, or I didn't hang out at the places where you could get them. So the journey's a really kind of interesting one, I think. Um, and of course, now we're in a situation when people are questioning the use of peat. People are trying to use less peat and trying to kiln in a more sort of efficient way as well. So yeah, it's I think we're in a very sort of dynamic and interesting moment in the whole sort of peated whiskey story. So yeah,
Sure, and we'll revisit the kind of climate change and
yeah,
ecological
sure.
value portion of it for sure. The conservation, that's the word I was looking for, the conservation aspect of peat as well. Um, so just jumping back to that point, not all the way back to the 17th century, but certainly in the mid 19th century, and perhaps even before, again, misconceptions. So, the associations that we have between peat and distilleries that we're familiar with today are they're far different than what it might have been in history. You mentioned in the book, Glenlivet taking great quantities of peat from Femusach. Please correct my
Yeah,
pronunciations, by the way.
yeah,
Um, that same moss bog that was also used by Tomentoul, Springbank, and Benriach,
yeah,
three distilleries, well, four if you include Glenlivet, four that you would think of as very different profiles from each other at this point, let
yeah,
alone whether or not they're peated. I mean, Glenlivet did a one-off release maybe in the last 20 years that
yeah,
had peat in it, but otherwise peat-free distillery. Similarly, Glenmorangie at the turn of the 20th century was cutting several thousand tons of peat each season, not just for fuel, but also getting flavor
yeah,
in there. But as you said, the peat use. Oh, sorry. There's one more quote I want to throw in there as well, and this is actually from the 1960s and 70s. When you're saying peat had really declined as a flavor component, as a primary flavor component in whiskeys, saying that in the 60s and 70s, floor maltings had virtually disappeared from Speyside distilleries, as did the peat use, hand in hand. But even in 1987, you had a quote in there that Speysiders still described their style. This is again 1987 as quote smoky, firm-bodied, with more than a hint of sherryish sweetness. So
yeah,
smoky is the first word that they used in there,
yeah,
and this is a style Highland Speyside in particular that is not really associated with peat. We
yeah,
have some distilleries, some brands, independent bottlers who are trying to break uh, that association now
yeah,
to, or rebuild it rather, I should say, to say no, there's peat in Speyside, there's peat in the Highlands, there's peat
yeah,
outside of Isla,
yeah,
to put it bluntly. But that cognitive dissonance has to take effect as you're looking into this to say no, there was plenty of peat flavor in
yeah.
Highland whiskeys.
Absolutely. And I think that was for me, it was one of the big eye openers in researching and writing this book. The importance of peat in terms of the establishment of many of the Speyside whiskies and how long it continued in the sort of mindset. And it's interesting, some of the old bottlings you can still taste, Speyside peat. And I do quite a lot of walking in the book, and it was really fascinating to connect some of the distilleries like Cardew. Now, we would never think of Cardew now as a peated whiskey, but they had their own
No.
peat bogs. So distillery workers went up there with their families in the summer to cut and let the peat dry and bring it back and fill the peat sheds full for the next 12 months. So, even when you look at Macallan, Cardew, you've mentioned Glenlivet, many distilleries had this strong peated profile. That was a real kind of eye opener to me when I wrote the book. And then, it was relatively easy to track down the sources and visit these bogs, which I do. There's a part of the story where I talk about the peat road,
Mm-hmm.
and then walking into this high level peatland and just seeing in front of your eyes the remnants, you know, the landscape, this man-made landscape with
Mhm.
drains and peat tracks and evidence of things like little peat railways as well. So we tend to associate obviously peat with certain areas, but at one time it had a huge influence. You mentioned Glenmorangie, um, and they were cutting peat from a number of areas, and it was a really significant part of what they were doing at one time. But now we'd never dream of having a peated Glenmorangie. But I probably shouldn't say that because they're a very, very innovative distillery.
I will say, never put it past Dr. Lumsden to throw peat in something or throw the malt in some new cask. Yeah, never put it past him. But to to your point, just while we're on it, of the the man-made aspect of what you see walking through these peatlands, um, I want to also compliment you on being, and maybe this is, I don't know if you did this before, but maybe this is part of the creative writing class as well that really helped with this, but very viscerally descriptive in what you're seeing. So
Yeah,
uh, I want to point to, you're describing Gardrum moss, and I want to read this straight from because it was a great description. It said, quote, I sense the land is tired, worn out, scarred, unloved and uncared for, forgotten. Its surface broken and punctured, the wounds unattended with no time to heal. Humans have come, taken away, left, returning occasionally under the cover of darkness to soil. Scar Hill, Thieves Hill, and Jaw Hill, my note, these are places on the
yeah,
moss, maybe tell of an even darker past, a land in need of love. End quote there. And then just a short one right after that, which was that about the tendency of writers to over romanticize peatlands. Juxtaposed with the reality of a harsher land, rich in fossil fuels and often quote, bearing the scars of industry,
yeah,
unquote.
yeah,
So the we'll get in a little bit shortly into where the peat's coming from today and how that impacts the questions of regionality and flavor. But there's really, I think these quotes speak to a couple of things. Number one, the impact on the peatlands, just straight up impact of what happens when you take away from the surface, when you're draining, cutting, and then secondarily to that, and perhaps more importantly, the fact that the land is not recovering as quickly. We I think we tend to think, for example, of reforestation. You can plant an oak tree in 50 to 80 years, it will regrow, cut down that oak tree, and the cycle continues. Now, that alone is a quite a long time period. It's a lifespan for a human. But the peatlands that you're talking about, some of the ones you walked through, had ceased activity for over 100 years.
yeah.
And it seemed in the way that you were describing them that over 100 years, longer than the span of that oak tree, that almost no
Restoration. Yeah,
restoration had happened on a normal level.
yeah. I mean, you mentioned Gardner Moss, and this is one of a series of peatlands that stretch out from where I live in Edinburgh towards Glasgow. These are these lowland peatlands that, again, I'd never worked on them. I didn't really know much about them, and many of them do have a relationship with some of the distilleries that exist in the Central Valley of Scotland. Rosebank, which has now been reopened,
Mhm.
um, St Magdalene in Lithgow, which is still closed, and one or two others. So I was keen to write about peats that are not this sort of somewhat idyllic kind of landscape with beautiful flowing heather and plants and birds singing and things like that. I mean, one of the things about the mosses you mentioned just there in the lowlands of Scotland is that they are being impacted by so many other things apart from peat cutting. So high, pollution. It was the kind of heart of the industrial revolution in Scotland. So there's a lot of contamination. And you mentioned, no restoration. Well, and many of the peat cutting companies would just walk away from these sites. That doesn't happen now, but restoration is peatland restoration is not rocket science. Once you stop, peats need to be drained to obviously be cut. They're just too wet. They're 90% water, so you just can't get machinery on there and you can't work there. So to bring the peat back, you need to block those drains and bring the water table back up towards the surface. And that hasn't been done in these bogs. We're now moving forward, and maybe we'll talk more about restoration later on.
Mhm.
But yeah, the peat just continues to sort of, if you want one of a term, bleed carbon. It just loses water, and the bogs are still degrading. So
Yeah,
yeah,
as I was reading that portion too, I made a note in the book that I was reminded of a recent release from Compass Box, in their Extinct Quartet series, the Metropolis release. That one was particularly designed to evoke memories of, I think the team actually used this word, dirtiness, and
yeah,
that industrial contamination of being in a city. And we have to remember, a lot of these, not a lot of these, that's the wrong word to use. Many distilleries were present in places like Edinburgh, Glasgow in particular, as a center of industry, because it's a center of industry, it's a center of trade. So barley would come in, peat would come in, trading, lots of industrial activity. And so, in both the whiskey and in the surrounding environments, such as the peatlands, there would be this contamination of soot, of aerosolized carbon, of all of these different things coming out, and has to settle somewhere eventually.
yeah, yeah. And when you look at peat, it has this wonderful ability to adsorb or retain pollutants. So we can see, if you look down through the profile of peat or sample it, you can see the moment when, lead started to be used in fuel. You can see when it was started to be mined. You can see the moment we stopped using lead in fuel. You can see the signals of volcanic eruptions from Iceland in Scotland, or the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, as a layer. So it retains these signals, and it will, retain these signals of man, if you like, of pollution,
Mhm.
through various, elements and chemicals within its profile. So it's a sort of you can use it as a kind of forensic thing. That's why it's so valuable, scientifically as well.
Sure. And let me stop there for a second, also, just to correct something that I said, which was, or that I maybe intimated, which was that this is we're still talking just in the realm of whiskey. And I should say the mosses and peatlands that we're talking about, as you said, they're not just stripped for whiskey.
No,
uh, Even at its height, whiskey was not the primary reason that peat was being cut, drained and cut and stripped, and not um,
yeah,
rebuilt. So the there's a point to that, which is that peat had so and has so many different uses. So in addition to fuel, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that was the primary source or the primary use of
yeah.
peat
It
for a
it,
very long
it
time.
was, it went,
Yeah.
yeah, it was in the past, domestic fuel in places where it was hard to get coal to, for example.
Right.
But the other major use, and still the major use, is horticulture. The
Right.
whiskey industry currently uses probably around about 2% of all peat that's cut in Scotland, and we're trying to use less and less. We're having this discussion now about banning horticultural use of peat from garden
Mhm.
centres. So peat use by the whiskey industry is relatively small, but it's changed. It's compared to 100 years ago, it's using large amounts of peat in a fairly inefficient way. It's used much more
Mhm.
widely. But now the amounts are so small compared to what was used in the past.
Sure. And in addition to, so the fuel, excuse me, and horticultural uses were always going to be the largest percentages, let's say, of
Yeah,
cutting of use, than whiskey as well. But I loved in the early 20th century, around World War I in particular, you were talking about some other uses of peat and sphagnum moss, things like wound dressings,
yeah,
preservation of foods and other materials,
yeah, yeah,
absorption, antiseptic. There was one portion where you're pointing to a point where people who lived on I didn't put this in the notes. It might have been Isla, but one of the islands that was heavily using peat had very little tuberculosis on the island,
Yeah, that
and
was
yet, yeah,
yeah, that was the island of Lewis,
of
and
Lewis.
the
Thing,
doctors
yeah,
recognised this, and they recognised that when people left the island, they would get TB, and it was this. They lived in these smoky, what we call black houses, which
mhm.
basically would kill the bugs
Right. I mean,
in the
this is the
house.
point where tuberculosis was still it was a death sentence at
Yeah,
that point. And
absolutely.
these people, if you lived on the Isle of Lewis, you were likely not to get it, which is amazing to me.
Yeah,
It's
yeah. It was
uh,
also, used as a sort of medicinal balm, peat bars and things like that. And
yeah, it
yeah,
was
it's
in
it's
soaps
fascinating,
and yeah,
curing fish, kippers making smoky fish.
yeah.
It's an
And,
amazing material with with quite a diverse and valuable kind of valuable uses in the past.
and like I said, it's 90% water. So this is something that clearly, if you dry that out fully, so the whiskey industry is drying it out to about
About
I don't know,
50%.
about 50%. Yeah.
Yeah,
So enough to still create smoke without
yeah,
just burning it. Um, but if you dry it out even further, you get something that is highly absorbent, on the level of something like a commercial gauze
yeah,
today.
yeah.
So they're using that in World War One as again
Yeah, I mean, they
wound
were
dressing.
using the top part of the peat, which was the sphagnum moss. So you'd use it as,
Right.
as a dressing because it had this antiseptic and absorbent property,
Mhm.
which meant that it would suck the moisture away and keep the wound relatively dry. And it was,
Right.
there were whole sort of armies of local people collecting peats, and then they were making dressings and sent them out. And they were, and this was a time that cotton wasn't available or very, very expensive
Sure.
during wartime.
And we should know too, you were saying this is the top level of peat. This is this really fairly fresh sphagnum there. Um, it's not the same portion of the peat that would be used for whiskey or for fuel. Um, Whiskey is going to be, and I'm going to throw out the names here that you may need to read, listeners, in order um, to absorb. Forgive the pun, but um, the portion of the peat that's being used for whiskey is going to be more like the H4 to H6 you wrote on the von Post humidification scale. So it's kind of
Yeah,
in the middle ish if you go
yeah, middle
down a
middle
couple
to lower
meters.
part of the
Right.
peat, which is denser, and it's more decomposed. So there's more. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's and it dries quite effectively.
Right. But not all the way down to the base and the lowest part, which is where you get the really compressed, short of coal, if you will.
Yeah,
The most compressed, this is going to be the most calorific
yeah,
and most useful for fuel. So each of these levels, I liken it to how we distill um, oil today and the different parts of
yeah,
petroleum that are going to give you
yeah,
different values and different uses. So again,
yeah.
if you don't necessarily need to look into the von Post humidification scale to
No,
appreciate
no.
that,
I
but it
mean,
was
I
worth.
think, I talk about peatlands over time being a kind of natural maturation process. So the chemicals, within the peat that are formed during composition break down at different rates. And ultimately, you're left with the least decomposable material towards the bottom of the peat profile. And that's where it's darker, colder, more acidic, wetter. So you get these much denser sort of materials, which are the kind of gold, if you like, in terms of energy or smoke. But it's interesting that a distillery now that still uses peat, Springbank in Campbellton, use both two types of peat. They use a wet peat and a dry peat. And obviously the wet peat generates a lot of smoke, but the dry peat gives a bit more energy. So I think traditionally kilns and distilleries would have had their own approaches to peating or kilning, and that partly would have been related to the peat that was available locally to them as well. The characteristics of that moss, for example, whether it was particularly dry or wet.
Sure. And we take for granted, I think, that you could not only you could use the local peat that was available, if it wasn't totally stripped at that point, but also that if you needed to go beyond your local borders, even past a few miles, that transportation was not only available but economical,
Yeah,
which is
yeah,
a much more modern conception than I think we take for granted. Um,
sure.
One of the many turning points in this book is for example, in the mid 19th century, when coal becomes more available, coal becomes the primary fuel source, replacing peat that had been used for about 200 years or so after that 17th century turning point
Yeah.
earlier.
Yeah.
The coal's it's used as a fuel source. It's heating the stills. It's kilning the barley, etc. But peat still did remain part of the process, and it seemed like that was there was a period of experimentation of seeing if
Mm.
we burn coal, will it create this kind of smoky character? What flavor is going to give to the
Yeah.
barley? And it did not seem to be very appreciated flavor. I'll say that.
No, it's not a particularly nice flavor,
No.
really. And I write about, I think one of the chapters in the book is called Peat Shed to Electric City, which looks at this
Right.
whole change in terms of energy source used in the whiskey making process, which I think is fascinating, all the way up to now when the energy we're moving towards much cleaner sources of energy as well. But it's interesting that some distilleries still appear to keep that sort of coaly kind of flavor profile. If you look at Campbellton
Yeah.
whiskies, there are one or two other examples, and yeah, it's interesting. And one of the sources I came researching the book actually found little particles of coal soot or grains actually in the malt. So
Oh,
although some influence obviously was becoming part of the or getting up into the flavor profile, but strangely now they're only I know Highland Park, for example, do use both peat or coke, which is
mm,
a cleaned up form of coal, and peat within their profile. And I think there's a distillery in Japan that also uses coal still
yeah.
as well. So yeah, it's interesting that the flavors of peat were still in demand, even though this wonderful, new black gold arrived.
So to ask an historical question on that, we started with in the 17th century where the bond is made, and again, subtitle of the book, the Unbreakable Bond. Could an argument be made that when coal arrives, you do have a partial breaking of the bond where the peat could be retained as part of the process for flavor purposes,
Mhm.
but because it was no longer exclusively needed for fuel, then distilleries didn't have to include peat if
No,
they didn't want to.
no. I mean, you can obviously make whiskey without peat, and most distilleries obviously do nowadays. But you know, the the bond was retained obviously in certain parts of Scotland more than others, so we started to see maybe more regionality expressing itself. Um, I mean, Lowland whiskey in Scotland has never been. One or two distillers did use peat, but there was a move obviously away from that. So we now think of Lowland whiskey as is unpeated
Mhm.
compared to the Highland distilleries, many of which had a much more subtle peating level. You know, and probably also related to the way the whiskey was made as well. So there was this is a nature and nurture kind of issue. I think
Sure.
maybe we get to talk about it in terms of regionality as well.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect segue into that because this is a huge topic, not only in the book. It's not really no, it is called out in the book because it's the name of a chapter at least, but it's something that beyond that, just that single chapter, it really has a through line throughout the entire narrative, and it's a question of regionality. It's where I think a lot of whiskey drinkers, when they're getting into Scotch, are introduced to it. Do you like Isla, or do
Yeah,
you like? And that's immediately that is almost a euphemism or a replacement word for do you like peat, even
yeah,
though we know there are some Islas that are not peated. But it's like, do you like Isla? It's peat. Do you like peat? That means Isla or Highland Park to a lesser degree. My personal journey went through Highland Park as opposed to going through Isla
okay,
to appreciate it. Um, and so but this regionality, the idea that Speyside and Highlands are mostly peat free, that Lowland is almost entirely peat free. It's lighter, it's grassier.
yeah,
Um, that and Campbelltown is funky. It's usually the
Funky,
word most associated with it.
salty, funky, a
Salty,
bit
yeah,
dirtier.
funky, right? A little more industrial, if you will.
Perfect in my eyes.
Yeah. Honestly, side note on that, I'm getting more into Campbellton, and this is more just a question of exposure. I
Yeah,
hadn't had much of it. Springbank is exceedingly hard to come by on this side of the Atlantic. It's hard to come
yeah,
by alone in the UK, but it's
absolutely.
just for production size. Um, but anyway, so the this idea of regionality, and it was it seemed like it started with marketing really taking off in the I want to say 20th century, where marketing really started picking up this idea of regionality as we think of it today, and then it's codified in many
Yeah,
ways
yeah,
as late as 2009 in the SWA regulations, where they're saying we have these 5 regions of Scotch,
yeah,
and that regionality is number one, obviously a massive oversimplification of
yeah,
what's really happening, but it misconstrues for consumers too how peat is used and where it's used and all that.
yeah. I
So
think
let's jump into that.
yeah, I think regionality is a really contentious topic, and a lot of people feel that it's no longer exists in the way it was. But if we just talk about peat and the flavors associated with it, I mean, people often talk about the differences between Highland peat, that's peat that's basically extracted from the mainland of Scotland, Orkney peat, which is more floral heather, if you like, and then obviously the Isle of peat from the west coast. So these differences are made, and I think we mentioned earlier Dr. Barry Harrison's work, and he was probably the person who linked these regional differences to a chemical signal or signature. So he did a lot of work. He sampled peats from these areas. He basically pyrolyzed the peat, so he basically killed them in
Mm-hmm.
reduced oxygen and looked at the products, and he was able to identify differences in the peat or in the combustion products of peat, which you could use, which you could separate these different regions from. But the big question, of course, is yes, you get it in the smoke, but is it then carried on into the distillate? And once it's in a cask, what is it like in 5 or 10 years down the line? And his group did well. He was able to certainly identify differences in people doing sensory analysis were able to identify differences. He had an experimental, distillation part, whatever, in the laboratory. But so yes, there was obviously that regionality, but these are very kind of subtle differences. And I think, the big question for me in terms of if we want to use the word terroir, I don't particularly like it, as you know from reading the book.
Yep.
Does those flavors exist, when a whiskey gets to 5 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old? And that's the big question. Even though you can identify chemical differences, doesn't necessarily mean that we as drinkers can pick up those differences. And the more I kind of looked at and read and talked to people about whiskey making, the distillation process, the kilning process, particularly as well, the more you can see, the hand of the maker
Mm-hmm.
in the way it can influence or change the peat profile. And a really good example of that, I think, is Torrevade Distillery on the Isle of Skye, the Skye's second distillery now on the mainland of Skye. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and they basically wanted to develop a sweet peat profile. So they used really um, different scientific methods or detection methods to try and tease apart this phenol profile that we talk about. Parts per million phenols is obviously the standard measure that you often see peated whiskies um, quoted as. But within those phenols, you have lots of different phenolic compounds. You have the real sort of Lefroy, Gardbeg, Cresoli kind of phenols.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the sort of more, spicy, if you like, in some ways, glycols and phenols. So they basically wanted a flavor profile, and they would play around basically with the distillation regime, the whiskey making process to try and tease apart those. As I talk about in the book, opening up the phenol black box. So you can, in that case, you can really see the hand of the maker, the craftsman, if you want to call that, in changing the flavor profile. So I think a big part of regionality is also the traditional way whiskey is made. And the way, there are lots of examples now because Torrevieja is a distillery that one of the new wave of distilleries, but they basically are a peat only distillery. That's all they make, as is the Lag distillery and Arran and one or two others as well. So they really, are developing a flavor profile which is quite different from, something like the Freud and Beck. And the other issue around regionality, I think, is as distilleries have lost over the years their connections to the local peat bogs. In the book, I think there were probably 70 or 80 different peat bogs that were close to distilleries, which had this relationship in which the workers went up and cut the peat.
And
That now has
sorry,
all moved to
that was from
big.
sorry to jump in. That was from
Yeah,
when Barnard was writing in the late
yeah,
1800s, right?
absolutely. And
Yeah.
a little bit later than that, there were still large numbers of local peatlands which had this sort of connection with the distillery. But as floor maltings closed and as the big industrial maltings started to come on tap, the numbers of peatlands used um, to generate distillery peat changed dramatically, and now we've probably got two or three big ones, seven or eight, including some of the smaller ones, and almost something like 60% of the peat or peated malt that is used in the whiskey industry globally comes from this one peatland in Aberdeenshire
Mhm.
called St Fergus Moss, which I write about quite a lot in the book as a family-run 100-year-old business. And that's quite significant, in terms of the flavour and effect it's had on regionality as well. So it's a really interesting subject and a kind of changing subject.
And that's the Northern Peat and Moss Company,
That's
correct?
right. Yeah, that's in
Yeah,
northeast Scotland. Yeah.
right. So Northeast Scotland, not Islay,
No.
um not neither Orkney, you know, Northeast mainland Scotland.
Yeah.
And this is towards the middle of the book. You're talking about when the Northern Peat and Moss Company comes up. Even as the popularity of peat whiskey has steadily increased, the company has not seen an increase in demand from the whiskey industry and the malting companies. This goes to what you were saying about, kilning efficiency has improved as a must do, as you quoting,
Yeah.
as a must do for a material that is becoming increasingly difficult to source.
Absolutely.
So uh, I want to, I'm going to, the next couple of minutes, they're going to be me talking, and I apologize for that, but I want to, there's a lot to throw in here from what you've written, and I want to make sure to get to all it to make a point. So starting in certainly the 1800s, if not earlier, you see peat from the UK going global. We have it from, and this is from that period all the way forward to today. You've got it from New Pitsligo
It's
peat going
like, yeah.
to Pitsligo, thank you, to Australia is one of the first
Yeah.
places, all the way other side of the world, going to Amrut in India, going to Hill Rock
Yeah.
here in New York in the US,
Yeah.
and Castle Malt in Belgium. Uh, all coming from the same source. I don't think you could argue in any way that these all taste the same, have the same peat profiles when
Absolutely
you come
not.
through. So there's this globalization aspect of it. There's the question of the locality, and I love Dr. Nick Morgan's quote here. It said the concept of whiskey terroir is, quote, cultural appropriation of the worst kind, unquote. um, it's
Yeah.
which I get. I do like the idea of terroir and whiskey. It's just a side note. I do like it.
Yeah.
Some people, in some cases, like I think what Waterford was doing, and hopefully, God willing, what they will be able to continue doing, was a great experiment in that. But Pete, I think, I thought this before the book, and then reading the book, this crystallized for me. I don't think Pete is part of the terroir conversation. I think it's very much more towards what appropriately, Dave Broom has named the sense of place
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
the maker. So as Dr. Morgan is saying, that the concept of whiskey terroir is cultural appropriation. It's not, doesn't
Yeah.
fit. The counterpoint which you make right following that is that, for example, does production method create terroir? And I'm quoting here: are the distinctive tastes of single malt whiskey made at Lagavulin and Kalila distilleries on Isla, using exactly the same specification of peated malt sourced from the same Isla bog, good
Yeah.
examples of why process defines whiskey character rather than terroir, unquote.
Yeah.
And so I before I turn it back over to you, I think that we'll expand that even further to say, as you said, we're no longer having 70, 80 bogs being worked. It's much, much more centralized now. So you have many peated, if you will, distilleries making peated whiskey, sourcing their peated barley, peated malt from the same malt house that may be using the same peat source,
Yeah.
perhaps
Yeah.
to different ppms on the McFarland method scale, but it's ultimately coming from the same place. So if you start with a particular profile, let's say
Yeah.
from the Northern Company, from Aberdeenshire, and then you farm it out to all these different distilleries, 20 different distilleries, let's say, that are using the same peat source,
Yeah.
different specifications. That's not terroir. That's really comes down to how is
Yeah.
that distillery, that production team using the peat, the malts, the
Yeah. Yeah.
all of that.
But yeah, I mean, most of that peat obviously is going through a malting, so then it's becoming a peated malt, which is then
Right.
sold to the distilleries. And some of those examples you talked about in terms of globalization is just this global, market for peated malt. And I think one of the so yeah, I think terroir. You know, if you go to a kind of wine show, you really get terroir, right?
Sure.
Um, and I do think the subject's a divisive, potentially a divisive subject. I think you have to understand, certainly the issue of the signals or the chemical signals that peat can impart into peated malt, but then also understand the nature of the whiskey making process. And like I said, mentioned Torre that was spending time there and talking to the guys that make the whiskey really kind of opened my mind. And
Right.
we looked at lots of chromatographs, and you can really see the way the phenols get pulled apart, as you speed up or slow down the distillation profile, change the cuts as well, the cutting regime. I mean, many, Ardbeg in the 1990s were doing quite a lot of experiments on peating, again, exploring, the flavor profile they get from changing the distillation runs.
I mean,
So, I think, you can argue, and I certainly, if you look at the European or the European Union definition of terroir, it does include the artisans or the makers of whiskey. And but then you go to a product like mezcal, which just speaks to terroir of me to me all the time. So
yeah.
anyway,
Then
that's
no,
diverging.
I agree. It's a question of kind of almost textualism versus interpretation
Absolutely,
there.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I can see why it's attractive to new distilleries who are really exploring things in a different way.
Sure. It as it has always been. It's an excellent
Absolutely.
marketing uh,
Yeah. And it's
technique.
one of the, wonderful things why we will love and talk about whiskey, right?
Of course, of course. I mean, there are, and this is both in the book and in a separate piece that you were quoted in for Distiller, which we were talking with a couple of actually former guests of the podcast. So Nick Neen Distillery,
Okay.
which is unpeated,
Yeah.
um, as well as oh man, I'm blanking on the other one now that I was talking about. But basically, the point being that the it comes down much more. Oh, it's Ardnamurchan, excuse me, was the other one
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
in there, and the idea that Ardnamurchan was also on the podcast, and they have peated water. And this is from early in our conversation. We were saying, got water that is, it's literally peated. It's yellowish, brownish. It looks,
Yeah,
for lack of a better term, it would look
yeah,
dirty to someone who wasn't familiar with it.
yeah,
Doesn't taste any different from
yeah.
what I've heard. I've
Nothing.
not had straight peated water, so I can't say.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with whiskey flavor.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with flavor either. And yet, some distilleries are definitely using that idea of, oh, we have peated water in our production process, so it's adding extra to it. And you're like, well,
Yeah,
unless it's unless the peated water is being put directly into the mashing process, that's the only place at which it's going, or the mashing process at the beginning or the proofing process at the end are the only two where it's going to have potentially a flavor impact. But then, because if it's in heating coils or
yeah,
the
yeah,
tubs around worm coils, it's not having any flavor impact. So those are the only two places where it could have the impact. And then you
yeah.
ask people who have actually tasted peated water, and they're this it doesn't taste like peat. It's not like it's smoky water or something
No,
like that. It
no.
tastes like
You,
water.
you need to combust the peat to get smoky flavors. I mean,
Right.
peated water may, influence the process in kind of non-smoky ways, in terms of containing particles possibly that absorb things or, you
Sure.
know, whatever. I mean, a lot of distilleries will operate, will settle the water, will filter it as well. But it's this lovely soft material, lovely soft water that many of the distilleries are kind of blessed with, I think.
Sure. But even so, it's beautiful for visualization. It's great for marketing. But when you get into the, if you will, nerdy side of analysis on this, it's not actually doing
No.
anything flavor wise. Um, so
Yeah, I mean
I want
it's one of those sort of whiskey myths. I mean that has been perpetrated and still exists.
of
About the
course,
importance of peaty water in the smoky flavors of
as,
whiskey, but
as long as you can get
there's never
someone
been
to
any
say,
evidence.
yeah,
Sorry.
as long as you can get someone to say subjectively, oh yes, I can taste peat in the water or what have you, then it's not false marketing because you
Well,
can have reasonable doubt.
yeah, I've tasted a lot of peaty water. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to everyone, but never tasted anything smoky.
Fair enough. Um, I just before we jump into the last major topic, which is conservation and the modern
Yeah,
climate role of peat, I do want to call out something that you spoke to, which was Dr. Barry Harrison's work pyrolyzing peat and identifying these compounds. It sounded like you got to experience this sensory panel of the
yeah. I
creosotes,
mean,
glycols, and phenols.
yeah. When I went to visit him, he works at the Scottish Whisky Research Institute. Is not far, in Edinburgh, just the edge
Yeah,
of Edinburgh. So yeah, he introduced me to the kind of sensory panel and what they would do in terms of identifying all these various different phenols, and it was a complete, eye opener to me. I mean, that's obviously how they train people, but the difference is, I mean, these were individual phenols that have been extracted, from plants or from insects or something like that. So a lot of them are naturally, available, and the differences were just remarkable, to me. And those were obviously the components that make up this smoky, you know flavor profile that we all enjoy as well.
yeah,
But it's interesting that a lot of the, just quickly going on to peat chemistry,
yeah.
is that we all focus on phenols, but there are other components of smoke that we know very little about. A lot of hydrocarbons in there that have not been identified. I think phenols are it's quite an easy thing to measure and grab hold of in terms of establishing a kind of malting standard
Mhm.
as well. But there's an awful lot we don't know about smoke, to be honest, which will for sure influence flavor as well. So I think that's quite an exciting piece of research that is beginning to happen. I know around the whiskey world here.
And I threw this in just as a side note, but it ties into what you just said too. Of phenols, perhaps are the most. I don't know if they're the most studied in fact, but like you said, it's the most identifiable with the technology we have right now. And so when you see a ppm on a bottle of whiskey,
Yeah.
it's it's parts per million, but it's really phenols
Yes.
parts.
Yeah.
as opposed, and that's not looking at the cresols or the guayacols. The guayacols for me, or that's like you said earlier, that's where you get the spicy, the black pepper, especially the vinyl guayacol in there. Um,
Yeah, what they have on the bottle is the parts per million in the malt, in the barley. So it's the starting
right.
ppm. Of course, what we're all drinking is a much lower concentration of phenols. Often you'll be losing 70 or 80% of the phenols in the process, probably through waste as well. So it is, it's one of those strange, quirky, wonderful things about the whiskey industry that you have
Mhm.
often quoted values which were of a starting material rather than the concentration ending up in the bottle.
And the I think many would ask once they find out that that's what it is, that it's the pre distillation value. The next inevitable question is, well, then why don't we measure at the end? And I'm if the guest is listening to this, forgive me for not remembering which episode this was, but we did talk about, as I said, the loss of ppm from the kilning process to the final bottling. And you said you can lose. I think we were talking about Talisker in particular, where it's about a 5 ppm measurement or so. But you could start with 50 ppms in
Yeah,
the malt and lose, you said 70, 80%. And that's
yeah,
to the new make spirit. And then
absolutely. Yeah, it's
again,
primarily through the waste streams because most of the phenols or the smoke is absorbed onto the surface
right,
of the barley, but also, depends where you cut in the distillation run.
of
You've
course. And
obviously got dilution going on as well, but I think a lot of it is lost to waste. And some distilleries, Torrevieja, Elsa Bay, one of another well-known whiskey, they quote both, which is good. And I know there are individuals which would like to see more of this in the whiskey industry, but I've been told by marketeers, we just like a big number.
that's the thing. And I think that it's both accurate and it's the easy answer, because bigger number,
Yeah,
if you're an octomore, and I'm a fan of Bruichladdich, if you're an octomore and you can say you've got 300 ppms in this whiskey, good lord, people are they're gonna look after it. They're gonna pay more for it.
mm,
It's gonna be, it's gonna make more news and all of that. So I fully get that. But you identified something, and it was at least something I was not aware of before reading your book, which was that this measuring peat levels comes from the McFarland method. And it to me, it made a lot more sense because the measurement started in a malt house and not in a distillery.
yes,
And if
yeah,
you look at it from that aspect, then that it adds on to, yes, it's still the bigger number is attractive and all of that, but it gives more logic to
mm,
the malt house is going to say, we can make it up to a 50 ppm. And if you're a distillation team that knows you're going to lose in the distillation process, plus whatever you're going to lose in the barrel over time, then that, to me, it solidified the answer a little bit more than just saying it was, the marketing teams wanting a larger number.
yeah,
And why this industry still uses what
yeah,
you'd use the term rather odd convention of expressing
yeah.
the phenol content
Yeah,
using the in
because
grain, not the
yeah, a
final
lot of
bottling.
distilleries will have a malt catalog and they will go through it and identify what they want. Of course, one of the criteria will be the phenol concentration. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense, particularly if you're selling it, globally as well. If you're shipping your peated malt around the world. So I think that's where it originates from. Even though now it's very, very straightforward to measure the concentration in the liquid as well.
Absolutely. It's 1968 is when that McFarland method
Yes.
started out.
Yeah.
We've been
Yeah.
more than half a century past that, and we're still using the in grain for most part. Um, so I know we have a short time left. I want to give most of it to the question of conservation, peatland restoration, and just that general topic, and then leave 1 minute for my surprise question at the end. So I will give you the open floor to talk about peat from the way that you studied it, and in conservation as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Like we said at the beginning, peat covers about 3% of the Earth's surface. It's our largest terrestrial carbon store. It's this wonderful natural carbon and capture um, soil that sits like a veneer on the Earth's surface. I mean, I think globally now, the figure I last saw was 600 gigatons of carbon are locked up, ideally locked up in peatlands. So, which is just to give it some sort of context, about twice as much to store it all in the planet's forests. So it's a huge and important carbon store, which we've been able to quantify better over time. We've been able to measure its status or its health better over time. And of course, one of the things, if you look at the United Kingdom or Scotland, let's look at Scotland, for example, about 80% of our peatlands are what you might call in poor health. They've been damaged in some way. And this isn't, by cutting necessarily, it's by things like um, uh, burning, construction of wind farms. It's been damaged by drainage for various means. It's been damaged by extreme climate events, drought, for example, and then followed by big rain events or big storms will wash away large amounts of the peat. And many of these peatlands have been in the past cut or drained for various reasons. As I mentioned earlier, peatland restoration is not rocket science. The thing that we need to do is to create or recreate a system which begins to lock up carbon more effectively in the past. So, that we have now the instruments to measure this. I worked on quite a lot of big projects which were measuring in a kind of carbon accounting way, if you like, the amounts of carbon coming in, being locked up each year by the vegetation, the amounts that were being lost back to the atmosphere, and also the amounts that were lost in the river systems to lakes or to the sea as well. So, many of our peatlands are damaged, and the challenge really for a country like Scotland is to restore those peatlands. And it's quite a dynamic and active conversation, as you can imagine, going on at the moment between various users of peat. And this year we're seeing a ban on the horticultural use of peat in garden centres. That's for you and I, whereas the horticultural industry is pot plants and growing vegetables and things still can use this shredded peat. So there are various ways of cutting peat. Some of the big bogs that we talked about already in Aberdeenshire will have an industrial cutting, so they'll drain it and they'll use machines primarily converted from the agriculture industry to cut the peat. But the restrictions now on what happens after the bog has been the cutting is finished now are quite different. It reminds me a bit of the restrictions that now exist in the mining industry in terms of bringing back land to health, restoration. So compared to 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, in terms of peatlands, if you're allowed to cut peat, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to do that, you have to have in place a peatland restoration strategy. So I think, in terms of the whiskey industry, they are a very small user of peat. But as horticultural use decreases, they will obviously become a bit more visible. So they're working very hard now with Scottish government and Scottish Whisky Association to come up with a strategy moving forward, which, I personally can't imagine, peated malt or peated whiskey not being made in Scotland, because I think, the Scottish government is pro-business. And I think we all understand how important peat is to the flavour profile of Scotch all around the world. It's part of the DNA of what we produce. So in my, I talk about in the book towards the end in terms of the whiskey industry um, uh, becoming involved in peatland restoration to the extent that they at least lock up as much carbon as they're using, or even more. And some companies like Beam Suntory, they've just changed their name, I know, but they're involved in some large peatland restoration work, which is not just looking at carbon, but it's also looking at the importance of water supply and security, because we've mentioned already earlier that peat is about 90% water. Well, a lot of distilleries in their catchments or watersheds, depend on peatlands at the back. So it's a kind of win-win situation. So, you know, so at the moment we're in, quite a dynamic situation, but, I think the documents I've seen, in terms of consultation and moving forward are, moving in the right direction you know, to come up with a way forward. And also kilning efficiency has been looked at as well. But one of the, if you like, the barriers is in Scots whisky regulations is we can only use peat to make smoke, and many other countries, New Zealand's a good example, North America's a good example. You use other materials to generate smoke and generate interesting types of flavors.
For sure. I immediately thought of, as you said, New Zealand is one of them. Santa Fe Spirits here in the US using, and some of the others in the Southwest using different woods to smoke as well. I don't know why the name of the tree is going right out of my head. Oh my goodness.
Well, New
It's
Zealand, it's Manuka
in
wood. That's the
right.
primarily, yeah, Manuka is the
And in the Southwest, it's a relative of the pinon tree, and it is going red mesquite. There we go.
ski. Yeah,
Wow,
yeah,
that was bad. But yeah, that does necessitate different flavors, of course. But as you said, there are sources, and just to put this on a somewhat human or even non-human time scale, as we mentioned earlier, the peat that they're using for whiskey specifically is not that top level. It's not the fresh sphagnum. It's down
no,
a few
yeah,
levels.
yeah,
So to just looking at Scotland to for ease of comparison, if we were looking at restoring the type of peat that is used for whiskey at that humification scale, I mean, what kind of timeline would we be looking at for that to be restored?
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think you're, yeah, I mean, I think peatland restoration science has come on hugely in the last 20 years. I would say 20 to 25 years, and I think all of us have been surprised how resilient many peatlands are, and we now talk about bringing peatlands, which are, some peatlands are going to be really damaged and very difficult and expensive to restore. But many peatlands you can bring back to what we would call ecological health in 10 to 20 years. And what we mean by that is that they're starting to lock up carbon and grow in the way you'd want to. So I think what you'd be looking at is a kind of mosaic of peatland restoration sites. And we're not talking about large amounts of peatlands, but the really interesting thing in Scotland, I think, is that it's not just about the science; it's also having the people on the ground that understand how to restore peat. So there's a
Mhm.
lot of work going on in terms of getting the kind of contractors and engineers up to speed and doing effective peatland restoration. So, that adds a lot of value to land as well. Um, so, I think the science has come on, and there's a very important connection, if you like, between science, the restoration community, and government as well. So it's quite a joined up process. But I think one of the barriers, quickly for peatland restoration is we have, a distillery, buying peated malt. We have the maltsters making it, and then we have the people producing it. So a joined up approach to peatland restoration is what is required in the whiskey world.
You need all those players to be rowing in the same direction,
Absolutely.
and it's difficult to do.
Absolutely.
Well, I do have one more question for you, which is very simply: has anyone studied or is thinking of studying this absolutely ridiculous topic, but whether cows and other feed animals enjoy peated draff more than unpeated draff?
That's a very interesting question, David. And I know exactly where you're coming from. And every time I go around on a distillery tour and somebody says that, I almost like, oh, here we go again. Um, Happy cows is about happy cows and lots of stories about happy cows. And there's stories also about, distillery warehouses being damaged, for example, and this, liquid, being released. But I'm not aware of anybody who's done that research. It sounds a bit like the Ig Nobel Prize, doesn't it? When scientists get
Yeah.
awarded for doing something really. But I will, if I'll have a look.
It's
And if I come up with something, you'll be the first to know.
it's a thesis. I don't know if it's worth writing, but it's a thesis to be written. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people I know have done work on you know, the waste dispersion, the way it's used on in farms, and things like copper as well. Some of these wastes are quite high in copper,
Mhm.
and so yeah, I mean, the cows seem to do well. I don't know if they're happy or not.
Yeah, maybe then maybe we'll look at it from the nutritional aspect. Is there more nutrition or more
Excellent
concentrated?
nutritional value. Absolutely excellent. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Mike Billett, thank you again for taking the time tonight for you today for me to speak about this topic, your new book. I highly recommend it to anyone with even a smidgen of interest in peat, in whiskey, in any of these topics we've discussed. Hang on with me for just a minute after I close out the recording. And we will certainly keep in touch with you for any updates around these topics and in the industry. So thank you again for coming on. We will have a link to the book in the show notes as always, and I'll probably write a review of it as well for a site or two for same reason, get a little more exposure and get more people reading it, especially now that it's available pretty much anywhere where someone is listening to this
Yeah.
podcast. So
Well, thank you, David. It's been an absolute pleasure.
excellent. Thanks, Mike. Hold on for one sec. Thank you everyone for listening, and I will see you all next week.